Hey guys, it's Peyton, and today I'm going to be telling you what I read in the month of January. This month I read 8 books. I'm pretty proud of it because 8 books is a lot for me. It may not be for some of you, but for me, I am quite happy with myself. And I read quite a few really good ones, so I am excited to tell you about them. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first book that I read in January was The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This was actually a reread for me, and I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. I originally read an arc of this book, and I actually reread my arc because I didn't have this copy of it yet. I finally decided if I've read the arc twice that I deserved a beautiful hardcover edition of the book, so I finally let myself have it. This book is such a fun fantasy with the most irritating enemies to lovers romance. Oh my god, but it's so interesting. It's about a girl named Jude who has a twin sister and one older sister, and they lived in the human world until one day a big buff fairy guy decides to murder her parents and take her and her sisters to fairyland. Her oldest sister is actually the daughter of this fairy, but Jude and her twin sister are humans. They're completely human and they do not belong in this world of fairy. The fairies don't really treat humans the way they should, but since they are under the general of fairy, they are given a higher status that most fairies don't really have, and they're forced to treat them, at least in front of him, correctly. This book has a lot of political intrigue. Jude gets wrapped up into politics and making sure that their king is someone that would not ruin the whole world and also hurt humans. Because within this book, the fairy king that has been the king for thousands of years basically is stepping down and someone else is becoming the king. And that leads to a lot of bad stuff because he has a lot of children and they all want the throne. Definitely a fun fantasy series. Every single character in this is so heavily flawed to the point where you don't even really like them, but it's so interesting. So I highly recommend this. It's not for everyone, but I'm just trash for it, so I think you could be too. The next book that I read is actually a nonfiction book, and I read this for school for my senior project, which I am doing a career exploration of an author, so I read 2 books on the life of an author, and the first book that I read for that was Bird by Anne Lamott. I actually gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars, and if you can't tell from all the tabs, I quite enjoyed this book and I got a lot out of it. There were so many motivational pieces and advice and stories. In each chapter, she kind of made an explanation of what she would say in her writing workshop because she has been the teacher of a writing workshop, and all of these chapters have lessons from that. But she does start off with stories from her own childhood and up until adulthood, obviously, and talks about her life as a writer and how she developed and the struggles that she has gone through, and it was so interesting for me. This book had so many lines that I related to so hardcore, and it also talked about the harsh realities of the publishing industry and how difficult it is to get into, which I appreciate because it is a true thing that it is a difficult business. It was interesting to read about, and this author has published quite a few books, so it was so cool to see her experiences and all of her problems that she has had as a writer. I'm really glad I read this, and I had to do a whole journal or whatever about my time reading this book, and it was quite fun actually because I actually enjoyed this book. The next book that I read was The Wicked King by Holly Black. This is the second book in the Fair and the Folk series. I really don't know what the heck the series name is, but I also gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. Maybe it didn't deserve it, but for some reason I could not give it anything else. It just was so entertaining, and the enemies to lovers romance is just, it goes on into this book. Most of the time when you have an enemies to lovers romance, it kind of resolves itself in the first book and they love each other, but no, they still hate each other so much in this book, but they're also so intrigued with each other and can't get enough of one another, really. There's not much I can say about this book because it is the second book in a trilogy, and I don't want to spoil you for what happens in here, but the adventures continue, the stakes get higher, and it's so interesting, and I am dying for the third book in this trilogy, The Queen of Nothing. I'm just so upset that we have to wait another year for that book, but I can't wait because this trilogy has been so fun so far, and I expect nothing less but the best for the next book. The next book that I read was The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas. I read this for the Mass Along that me and Brittany and Books are hosting. It's basically we read a book of Sarah J. Maas's every single month, and just letting you know, Throne of Glass is the book for February, so if you want to read that one and join in for a live show at the end of the month, you can. We've already had our live show for The Assassin's Blade, so I will put a card for that so you can go watch it after hopefully you read it, because what's the point of watching a live show book discussion on a book you haven't read? I actually have read this book before, and I originally gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, but upon rereading it, I've given it a 4 out of 5 stars. I think back then, so many years ago, I think it was 5 years ago that I read this book. It was published in 2014, so I read this book 5 years ago, and I was in that stage of, oh my gosh, Sarah J. Maas is my favorite author. I gotta give every book by her a 5 out of 5 stars. I'm a little bit more critical of a reader, so I just felt like this was more of a 4-star read for me. I enjoyed the novellas even more than I think the first time, though. It makes no sense. It's just because throughout the series, you see some of the characters that you meet from this novella collection that takes place before Throne of Glass, and it's just really interesting to see how that all ties together, and then coming back to read the novellas about them being first introduced. That was interesting for me, but in the end, Sarah J. Maas is better with full-length novels. I did not think this was her best work or anything. And if you don't know what the Throne of Glass series is all about, it's about this girl named Selena Sardothian. She's the most notorious assassin in all of Aurelia, which is a continent. And she kind of had her downfall and was put into a death camp where she was supposed to live out the rest of her days suffering, that sort of thing. But one day, a prince of the king that put her there and the captain of the guard take her out of the death camp and offer her a deal on if she competes under them in this game that the king is holding, trying to find the king's champion, which is going to be his own personal assassin. They want her to compete against a whole bunch of other assassins and thieves for this position of the king's champion, and she can either do that, have that chance of freedom afterwards, or stay in the death camp. And obviously she decides to leave, because why would you want to stay in the death camp? I don't know. The series goes in so many directions that you would never expect. It is a full-length adventure. It's massive, and I think it's so worth it in the end. So it was so nice to reread this and see Selena when she's a little bit younger, and she is still the notorious assassin before the death camp. I loved it. But still, it was a 4 out of 5 stars because it wasn't the most amazing thing, but it was still enjoyable for me. The next book I read was actually the second book that I read for my senior project, and that is On Writing by Stephen King. This is Stephen King's memoir of him being a writer, and I also found this one really interesting, but I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. The other one was a 5. I just felt like I got more out of it in the end, and you can probably tell because I don't have as many tabs as I did for the other one. I am a big fan of Stephen King. I have not read all of his books. It's been like 4, but his books are massive most of the time, so it's like a lot to get into. But I really have always admired him. I've watched so many of his speeches online, pretty much all of them, whatever. And I have been greatly interested to read about how he became a writer and how he got published, and just insight on how he goes about his everyday life, at least when he wrote this in 1999. Another really interesting thing about this book is while he was writing it, he actually got hit by a car. He's famous for being hit by a car in 1999, but he put a postscript at the end of this book of him recounting that experience, and it was literally like a scene from a novel. It was so intense, and I found that so interesting. He explained the moment that he finally sat back down and wrote again, even though he was in immense pain for just sitting up. It was so magical of a moment. I loved reading that, how he wanted to write even if it hurt him because he needed to write. Love that about this book, though I didn't agree with everything that this book said, which is to be expected sometimes. Like, you don't always agree with what a nonfiction book says, especially if it's a lot of opinions in here. I didn't really agree with how he said a bad writer could never become a decent writer, because I do believe you are born with a natural ability for writing, but I do think, as we know, that every time you write, you get better, and I just feel like a bad writer isn't stuck forever being a bad writer, that if they practice enough and learn the rules, that they could become a decent writer. That's just my personal thought on that. There's a few other things that are escaping me now that I didn't fully agree with, but I did really find it interesting reading his whole process and also seeing the behind the scenes on some of his most famous books that I love, on how he got the ideas for them and how he wrote them. It was really cool. The next book that I read was The Pact by Jodi Picoult. I actually was lent this by my boyfriend's aunt, and then I went to the used bookstore and bought myself my own copy because I enjoyed it enough for that. I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. This book was really dark. It is about a suicide pact between a boy and a girl who have known each other since literal birth. Like, when the girl was born, he was a baby and they put him on the mother's lap with baby Emily. So it's Chris and Emily, and they're so close that they don't even know how to be apart, and they ended up eventually becoming a couple. This book is told from the perspective of the parents as well as the kids. The parents are inseparable as well, but not nearly as much as Emily and Chris. And one night changed everything. So basically, Emily and Chris had a gun, but Chris is the one that got the gun. And they went to a carousel. A bullet was in Emily's head, and Chris survived. He was okay, just with a minor injury. Chris, when he got to the hospital, says that this was a suicide pact, that nothing else was going on but that they just wanted to go out together. Some evidence is being collected, and it kind of looks like a murder. So this book is really, really dark, and it tears families apart, and people that loved each other for years are no longer buddies anymore, and you as the reader don't know the whole time whether or not Chris really killed her or if it was a suicide pact as he said it was going to be. It was very interesting on that part. I was sucked into the book the whole time because I was really, really interested to see how the whole story was going to unfold. And Emily and Chris were teenagers, but unfortunate for Chris, he turns 18 like a few days after this tragedy, so he is able to be hit by the law, which means he might be going to jail, you know? Like, he's actually going up against some really scary charges. I don't know if this book handled the topics such as suicide, which, by the way, major trigger warnings for suicide, sexual assault, rape, things like that. It's filled with a lot of those things, so I definitely think you should be mindful of that before you pick this book up on whether or not you would be okay to read this. I don't know if those depictions were the most accurate or the most delicately handled, so I can't speak on that, but I can say I really enjoyed the story and it was a crazy ride. I didn't feel extremely connected to any of the characters, so that probably added me going for a 4-star rating instead of a 5, but it was definitely different for me because this is an adult book, if you don't know, and I don't really read that many adult books, so it was different for me, but I really enjoyed my time with it. The next book that I read was A Study in Charlotte by Brittany Cavallero. I gave this book a 3 out of 5 stars. It was a fun little mystery read. I was hoping that I would love it a lot more because book Twitter is in love with this book, it seems. I was hoping for a 5-star read, but in the end, I enjoyed the storyline. I enjoyed the characters as well, but I didn't have like an overwhelming love for the whole book in general. I don't really know why it was like that. It just didn't feel like some outstanding piece or some outstanding mystery that kind of deserved such a high rating. It was just fun for me to read and very quick read. I did enjoy Jamie and Charlotte. If you don't know, this is a twist on Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Basically, it's put in modern day, and Sherlock is a girl, so she's Charlotte Holmes. They are descendants of these people, and they go to a boarding school and finally meet each other. They're like destined to be best friends from what everyone thinks about them, and then they get framed for murders that start to happen at their school, and they have to figure out the mystery and obviously get out of trouble because people think they did it. Really fun. I already purchased the second book in this series because I do want to continue. It's definitely a fun little thing to read very quickly, and I'm excited to see what else happens with this book. I just didn't think it was some crazy amazing piece of literature. The final book that I read in January is actually another novella collection. It is Unite Me by Tahira Mafi. This has Destroy Me, which is from Warner's perspective from the Shatter Me series, and Fracture Me, which is Adam's perspective, and it also has Juliet's journal at the end of the book. I've been wanting to read this for a while, and I finally got this book out of Book Outlet, and I annotated it. Really didn't do much other than just like underline a bunch of things. Also at the beginning of novella sections, I would just write like Aaron Warner for Destroy Me, and I do that for Adam. He doesn't deserve a heart though. Sorry, I like Warner better. I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I really love the Shatter Me series. I reread them last year and it was such a fun ride for me, and I re-experienced my love for the series. I definitely loved it way more than I did the first time. So I was so glad to finally see the perspectives of Warner and Adam back in the earlier books, because we do get Warner's perspective in the 4th Shatter Me book, which, by the way, so excited for Defy Me. I am forever waiting for that. It's getting closer and closer, so I'm excited. I had a lot of fun annotating this. It was a very quick read just because it's really short and it's a little novella collection. Went by really fast, but it was a nice little final book for the month. Don't really have much to say other than I love this series and it was a fun addition to the books. So those are all the books that I read in January. I'm pretty happy with myself. Tell me down below if you read any of these books and what you also read in January. Like this video, comment down below. Have a good day. Please subscribe. Make sure to follow all my social medias, which are linked down below, and go click the bell button, which is right by the subscribe button, which you should have already clicked, and goodbye.